rules say I have to give Mr. Rawling an opportunity to have a say. You have anything you want to say, Mr. Rawling?
Well, sir, if it please the court, could I address the court?
Sure, say whatever you want to say.
Thank you. And, I recall the day I first saw you. I reached out to say I love you, but it was hard to say. I couldn't touch you. So tell me, baby, what were my words? All my tears run together.
Excuse me, Mr. Rawling.
Down the path you choose to follow.
Mr. Rawling.
In 1999, a Linwood, California woman was stabbed to death in her home. Her 1-year-old daughter was present at the time, but fortunately nothing happened to the child. The only other people in the house were her 17-year-old son, his 2 cousins, which were 16 and 12. The boys had been watching horror movies for the last few days. Rita Castillo's son and his cousins were later charged with murder, and in the interrogation, they cited Scream as their inspiration. See, we all know of the Scream movies and the main perpetrator, the Ghostface Killer. When you hear that name, it automatically puts the picture in your head. And for some generations, it brings up thoughts of fear and dread. Honestly, my introduction to the character was the first Scary Movie, and that's basically the parody of the Scream movie. But today, we're going to be looking into the true crime case that inspired it all. Yes, there's an actual case that inspired the Scream movie. This is the case of Daniel Rowling, known as the Gainsville Ripper, who killed 5 college students in Gainesville, Florida. Now, if you like this sort of content, make sure you have relations with that like button. And when you go to get the DNA test, make sure that you're not the father. Today's question for the comments is, what's your favorite cereal to eat at night? Daniel Harold Rowling was born in Shreveport, Louisiana. Now, Shreveport's actually known for having tons of Bigfoot sightings, hundreds of Bigfoot sightings, in fact. And one of the other facts about this place is that an old plantation in Shreveport was used in the HBO series True Blood as like a backdrop. Now, Danny's father was a local police officer who straight up told him that his birth was a mistake. He told him to his face that he was an unwanted child. Danny's father, James, was a troubled child himself. His father would beat him. So James had continued this awful abuse down the family tree. He would beat his wife, he'd beat Danny, and he beat their other son, Kevin. And this was for nearly nothing. Most of the time it was because he didn't like the way they were speaking or he didn't like the way they were breathing. So he would often abuse them just for simple things. If you were in his way when he was coming home from work, something just as simple as that, leaving your books on the table, anything, you could accidentally be in this man's way. And he would strike at times that were unpredictable. Like, for instance, one night he went to his wife who was sleeping next to him. He had woke up in the middle of the night and he drags her out of bed and he forces her to go to the bathroom and he threatens her with razor blades, and he tells her to cut herself with the razor blade. So he good dad, he good husband, he good man, okay? Danny's mother made repeated attempts to leave his father, but she never did. She always came back. Another horrifying thing that he did to Danny is he would take his face and push it down into the ground and bury it in the mud and spit on him. And then he would handcuff him and have his friends from the precinct come down to arrest Danny, throw him in the back of a car, take him all the way down to jail, and make him spend the night behind bars. All because he felt his son was an embarrassment to him. Around the age of 5, Danny had gotten a dog from his mom for his birthday. This dog was very playful. He spent so much time with this puppy. They had gone everywhere together. Everywhere Danny would go, this dog would follow. This was truly his best friend. More than his brother, more than his mother, and especially more than his father. And every day around dinner time, when Danny was meant to come inside for the night, the dog would try to follow him inside, but James made the dog stay outside, which is fine. But this dog would miss Danny and sit outside at night and bark and howl and whine and whimper, and Danny just had to listen to this because the dog was actually right outside of his window. Since his father James was a police officer, he rarely got quality sleep. So one night he just snapped. Danny was still awake after being told to go to sleep, and his father had actually abused him this night and made him stay in his room and locked him in his room. Danny thought that the dog howling would enrage his father. He thought he could just let the dog come inside and lay in bed with him so he would stop making all these noises. He hears his father coming down the hallway past his door in an angry, like a full-blown rage. He's stomping through the house. And as his father is charging down this hallway, he's yelling things like, "That damn dog, I'm going to kill this dog." And he's making his way outside. This dog wasn't that big, it was fairly small. Outside the window, Danny had to watch as his father was punching and kicking and stomping at this Danny's best friend. As you might imagine, this really messed with him because he had to witness this. And so the next day, his father buries the dog and tells him to never speak of it. So Danny more or less grows up as a troubled teenager, and he actually goes around and is arrested for robbing places, burglarizing places. He was caught spying on women getting dressed. As an adult, he had quite the trouble assimilating into society. He wasn't really able to hold down a steady job. He rarely had a place to live. He was always jumping around and sleeping on people's couches. He definitely was not allowed back in his parents' house at this point. The only happy memory of his childhood that he recollects is getting a guitar for Christmas when he was 15 years old. He used music and art to escape the broken world that was around him. He even attempted to unlife himself. He could never commit to the act fully. He developed many personalities around this time he used as a defense mechanism, so he was treating himself as many different people in order to sort of stay away from getting to know anyone personally, because he was, for the most part, he was embarrassed about his life and how things were going at home. He figures since there's nothing for him where he's at, after committing all of these crimes in his hometown, he decides he needs some sort of structure, so he enlists in the Air Force. But shortly after, he's kicked out for drug possession. He married a woman named Omather Halko, with whom he had a daughter. But just like his father did to him, he passed on the abuse straight down. From generation to generation, the abuse continued, and he inflicted this on his wife and his very own daughter. From here, things began to spiral down, and they got a lot worse. This led to him divorcing from his wife. Shortly after this, he went on to force himself onto a woman that resembled his ex-wife. He embarked on several armed robberies, eventually getting arrested in Jackson, Georgia. And in the 1980s, things did not get better for Rowling. He was in and out of jail in Alabama, Mississippi for armed robbery, skipping towns, jumping all over the place, all over the country, and any place he was in, he was typically caught for armed robbery. But on the occasion, he would force himself upon more women. And in 1989, this is when things turned deadly. He returns back to Shreveport, and while working at a restaurant, his anger got the best of him, which led to him getting fired. And on this day, he broke into a home to murder a 24-year-old Julie Grissom, her 8-year-old nephew, Sean, and her 55-year-old father, Tom. Julie was found with bite marks on her body, arranged with her leg spread on the bed. And that following May, he got into a final argument with his father. This time, though, he pulled out a gun and shot his father, James, in the stomach and in the head. His father survived, but he lost the use of his eye. He fled to Kansas and Florida, eventually arriving in Gainesville. In the early morning hours, Friday, August 24th, 1990, Rowling broke into the apartment shared by 17-year-old university freshman Sonia Larson and Christina Powell, finding Powell asleep on the downstairs couch. He stood over her briefly, watching her, but he did something strange. He decides that he's not going to mess with her. Instead, he's going to investigate the rest of the apartment. It's very disgusting, but in his mind at this point, he's thinking this is the girl that he wants to force himself on. So he's not going to do anything to her. He's not going to kill her. He's going to leave her there. So he goes deeper into the apartment and begins to climb the stairs. Arriving at the room of Sonia Larson, he creeps into the room. The door was already opened. The floor was carpeted, so his footsteps didn't make much noise. Sonia did not wake up until Danny was close enough to get his hands on her. And so he takes his hand and he puts it right on her face. And he takes some tape that he had in his pocket and he starts wrapping it around her head. He did this to stifle her screams. Then he begins to stab her to death with a kabar knife. She was trying to defend herself, and so there was blood on the walls, there was blood all over the sheets. There was a definite struggle here, but she did not survive. Danny then went back downstairs, and he followed a similar formula. He taped Christina's mouth shut, bound her wrists together behind her back, and as this is happening, he has already informed her that her friend upstairs is already dead. And now he has this knife, and he's threatening her with it. He's threatening to kill her, and he's slowly cutting her clothes off. And then Danny forces himself onto Christina, and he takes her face and he pushes it down into the floor, and he stabbed her 5 times in the back. He then takes it a step further and positions the bodies in a sexually provocative way. I don't want to fully describe the way he left them. Takes a shower himself, and he cleans up in their apartment before leaving. So after this, Danny has already killed a few people. At this point, he feels that people are onto him, and he thinks in this time that he needs to kill as much as possible, as frequent as possible, and now he's addicted to it. So a day later, on Saturday, August 25th, Rowling broke into the apartment of 18-year-old Krista Hoyt. Again, arriving with a full utility belt, he pulls out this screwdriver and he pries open the sliding glass door, but Krista isn't home. So instead of leaving and coming back, he actually waits, and it becomes a thing for him. He sort of enjoys this process. He hides out in her apartment. So he waits in the living room for a few hours until she returns at 11 a.m. Krista Hoyt grabs the mail from her mailbox and walks towards her door. She feels that something is off, but she decides to proceed into her apartment very slowly. As she opens the door, she looks across and she sees that the sliding glass door has been pried open. So she heads in that direction. But Danny had been standing directly behind the door that she had just opened. And he comes up from behind and puts her in a chokehold. And again, he duct tapes her mouth, he bounds her wrists, he leads her into the bedroom, and he once again forces himself upon her, and he then flips her body over after he has stabbed her in the back, as he did to Christina Powell, and he cuts her from her pubic bone all the way up to her breastbone. He leaves her there, right on the bed. He doesn't position her in any way. He goes to return back to his campsite, because as this is going on, he's not actually living anywhere. He's camped out in this wooded area, and he's basically stalking the campus. He's near it, but he's not living in anything. He's not in his car or anything. He has actually set up a small camp where he observes them. Just like in his childhood, when he would look at women, he would stalk them, basically. But he made one mistake with this one. He actually left his wallet behind. Returning to find his wallet, he decides that he's not done. He proceeds to decapitate Krista Hoyt. He placed the body sitting upright at the edge of the bed, and he put her head on a shelf across from that, facing the rest of her body. And later on, he claims that this was something he wanted to do so that the person who found this was immediately disturbed. Yeah, anybody would be. And at this point, the murders had attracted a whole bunch of media attention. Forcing students to take extra precautions, people were now on the lookout for something like this. Locking their doors, locking their windows. Everyone started to carry something to defend themselves with. Another thing people were doing was they began to change their routines, because it seemed that the only reason he was able to do this is because he had stalked these people for a long time, and he figured out their daily routines. Everybody started switching up everything that they did. They weren't going to the same places they would normally go. Some of them would stay in their apartment for long periods of time just watching and waiting. And people started to travel in groups. This caused a whole bunch of students to actually withdraw from the semester because this was early in the fall and a lot of people hadn't actually arrived yet. But once they heard about this, they were not going to that school. They transferred schools entirely. Tracy Paulez, who was 23 years old, was living with her roommate, Manny Taboda. On Monday, August 27th, Roland broke into their apartment by prying open their sliding glass door. He used the same tools that he had used previously. Whether these people were not paying attention, they weren't worried, too cocky. Something as simple as knowing how someone was committing these acts should have had them take these precautions, especially the sliding glass door. Once again, he creeps in, and this is in the early morning hours, so Manny Taboda is asleep. He creeps over Taboda and figures if he's going to get to the girl, he's going to have to deal with the guy. Begins stabbing him frantically as he's waking up. Manny wakes up and he has already been stabbed. Imagine waking up to a stab wound. Imagine waking up to being stabbed. Like you have not fully died yet and you're waking up out of your sleep and you're already being stabbed. But this caused him to start to fight back. But by this point, he was already bleeding all over the place. And so he didn't have a lot of energy. He wasn't the best equipped to fight back. And there was somewhat of a struggle, but ultimately Danny did kill him. Previously, all of Danny's murder victims were small, petite women that resembled his very own mother. But now he had killed a full-grown, covered in blood after stabbing a roommate more than 30 times. Tracy Paulez comes into the room, and she asks, "You're the one, aren't you?" Danny says, "Yeah, I'm the one." Tracy Paulez had entered the room carrying a curling iron, and at the time Rowling believed this was a weapon, so he lunged at her, and soon she was also dead. Other students nearby heard this. Instead of finding their friends alive, they found blood on the floor and a black bag, and instead of entering the room, they run to find help. And at this point, it is believed that Danny Rowling was still in the apartment when their friends found them. And so there could have been more victims. So law enforcement actually had very few leads, but they did come up with two suspects here. One suspect was Edward Lewis Humphrey, a University of Florida student who had a history of mental illness and bore numerous scars on his face from a car accident. Humphrey was arrested after a physical altercation with his grandmother and held in custody for 5 months. And the second suspect was actually cleared. The cops had initially thought that this was someone who was going to the school, and it had nothing to do with somebody who was an outsider, a stranger, a hitchhiker, just a random guy, a random passerby, a wanderer. But that's who was doing this. Louisiana police alerted Florida authorities to an unsolved triple murder in Shreveport, Louisiana. In the first triple murder that he committed, he had posed the people in sexually provocative ways. He had duct taped their mouths shut. And each time he used a vinegar solution to clean the bodies. So an investigator on the case travels to Shreveport in November of 1990. And a link was made from the cases in Gainsville to those in Shreveport. In Shreveport, there were 4 samples of blood. The 3 victims and 1 from Danny. And it was type B blood. The same DNA was found in Gainesville. Shortly after this, a resident in Shreveport, Cindy Jarakich, had called Crime Stoppers and reported that Danny was a potential suspect in these murders, and he's possibly connected to both cities. 3 months earlier, in August of 1990, Jarakich heard a news report about a string of murders as she traveled through the Florida Panhandle. The report made her think about Rowling. She actually met him in the church. Rowling had said deeply disturbing things to both her and her then husband. Stephen Dobbin was Cindy's husband at the time. One day, he comes in and he says, Danny has to go. And she's like, why? And he ends up telling her, he says, well, Danny has a problem. And she says, what kind of problem? And he replies with, he likes to stick knives in people. Originally, Cindy laughed this off as it just didn't seem like that's the type of person he was. So she completely written off these comments her husband just gave her. One creepy comment that Danny had made to Cindy while they were in the church together, he said, one day I'm going to leave this town and I'm going to go to where the girls are beautiful and I can just lay in the sun and watch beautiful women all day. All the while this is going on, Danny he acts like he's untouchable, right? He's just killed a whole bunch of people. He has already committed 3 murders in the previous town, and now at this point he's up to 5. All while this is happening, he's still being arrested for robbery, so he just doesn't even care. She immediately calls police and reports to them that they should be investigating Danny Rolling. So investigators respond to the tip and they quickly find Rolling. He had been arrested September 7th in 1990 for a supermarket robbery. The robbery had been committed 10 days after the bodies of Paulez and Tabota were found. Rolling was being held in the Marion County Jail 40 miles south of Gainesville. Investigators determined that Rolling had type B blood, the suspect in both the Gainesville and Shreveport murders. Once Florida investigators realized that Rolling had multiple convictions for armed robbery, they realized he could also be responsible for the bank robbery that occurred on the day Krista Hoyt's body was found. They returned to the evidence locker where the gun, screwdriver, bag of money, and cassette player had been stored and listened to the tape. They found tools matching marks left at the Gainesville murder scenes. Investigators discovered audio diaries that he made alluding to the crimes. Later it was discovered on August 5th, 1990, Roland broke into the home of Janet Frake in Sarasota, Florida. He bound and gagged her with duct tape while he sexually assaulted her, but he didn't kill her. In November of 1991, Rolling was charged with 5 counts of murder. He was brought to a trial nearly 4 years after the murders. He claimed his motive was to become a superstar, similar to Ted Bundy. In 1994, before his trial, Rolling unexpectedly pleaded guilty to all charges. On April 20th, 1994, Rolling was sentenced to death. Shortly before he was executed in Florida for the series of killings in Gainesville, Rolling claimed responsibility for the Shreveport murders. Rolling had a last meal of lobster tail. He sang a gospel hymn, but made no statement immediately before his execution, which was witnessed by many of the victims' relatives. Rolling was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison on October 25th of 2006. After the U.S. Supreme Court rejected a last-ditch appeal, he was pronounced dead at 6:13 p.m.